class, we will be discussing the history of use of iron in Indian subcontinent, role of irrigation in making kingdoms powerful, and people in villages. So let us take a look at the topics that we will be discussing in today's class. History of the use of iron in Indian subcontinent, role of irrigation in making kingdoms powerful, people in villages. So, iron and steel is an important part of our life today. From small objects like needles and pins to ships and heavy machines, we use iron. But you may want to know how it began its use. The use of iron began in the Indian subcontinent around 3000 years ago. Some of the largest collections of iron tools and weapons were found in the megalithic burials. We have discussed megalithic burials in our earlier videos. Can you recall what megalithic burials are? Around 2500 years ago, use of iron tools was grown. Some of the iron tools are shown in the image. Axes were used for clearing forests, whereas iron plowshares were used in farming. When we learnt about the Mahajanapadas, we had discussed how iron plowshare was useful for increasing agricultural production. Villages had a special role in making the kings and kingdoms strong. Villages flourished, paid taxes to kings and made kings and kingdoms strong. Around 2500 years ago, villages flourished due to adopting technologies such as iron plowshare and paddy transplantation. With the use of iron plowshare and paddy transplantation, production increased. Besides, various sources of irrigation such as canals, wells, tanks, and artificial lakes were also built during this time. Usually, kings were also involved in these irrigation works. Kings provided money and planned for irrigation works. Labor was provided by the local people. The image you are seeing on the screen is of Sudarshan Lake. It was built by the Maurya Emperor Chandragupta Maurya. Due to irrigation, production increased and farmers benefited. In return, kings demanded more taxes from farmers. Kings with more taxes could maintain large armies and could conquer other lands. Thus, they became more powerful. Villages were found everywhere in the Indian subcontinent. Generally, people living in these villages were of three kinds. First were large landowners, second were ordinary farmers having land, and the third kind of people were landless laborers, including slaves of people. However, the name by which these three kinds of people known as were different in southern India and northern parts of the subcontinent. In the Tamil region, large landowners were known as Vellalar. Ordinary farmers were known as Umsavar, and landless laborers, including slaves, were known as Tadaisiyar and Ademiyar. In the northern part of the country, independent farmers were known as Grihapatis. Most of them were smaller landowners. Landless laborers were known as Karmakara, whereas male slaves were known as the Dasa and the female slaves were known as Dasi. Karmakara, Dasa and Dasi did not own land and had to earn a living by working on the fields owned by others. In every village of North India, there was a person who owned the largest land. He was known as the Grama Bhojaka. He was the village headman, and usually the post was hereditary. That means the position of the village headman was held by his family for generations. The Grama Bhojaka had slaves and hired workers to cultivate the land. He was so powerful that the king often used him to collect taxes from the village. He also functioned as a judge and sometimes as a policeman. In most villages of the subcontinent, there were some craftspersons also, such as the blacksmith, potter, carpenter, and weaver. Let us take a recap of today. The use of iron began in the Indian subcontinent around 3000 years ago. Some of the largest collections of iron tools and weapons were found in the megalithic burials. Around 2500 years ago, use of iron tools was grown. These included axes for clearing forests and iron plowshare in farming. Around 2500 years ago, various sources of irrigation such as canals, wells, tanks and artificial lakes were built. Kings provided money and land for irrigation works, and labor was provided by the local people. Villages flourished, paid taxes to kings, and made kings and kingdoms strong. Kings could maintain large armies and could conquer other lands because of the taxes received from villages. Generally, people living in villages of Indian subcontinent were of three kinds: large landowners, ordinary farmers having land, and landless laborers, including slaves of people. In the Tamil region, large landowners were known as Vellalar, ordinary farmers were known as Uzavar, and landless laborers, including slaves, were known as Gadaisiyar and Adimai. In the northern part of the country, independent farmers having land were known as Grihapatis. Landless laborers were known as Karmakara, whereas slaves were known as the Dasa. And Karmakara and Dasa had to earn a living by working on the fields owned by others. In every village of North India, there was a head of the village known as the Grama Bhujaka. He owned the largest land, which was cultivated by slaves and hired workers. He was so powerful that the king often used him to collect taxes from the village. He also functioned as a judge and sometimes as a policeman. In most villages of the subcontinent, there were some craftspersons such as the blacksmith, potter, carpenter, and weaver. And that is all in this video. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Bye.